Now we're going to move on to the actual interview process and some of the bias that might come into play when you're actually interviewing candidates. There are over 150 different types of bias, so we're not going to cover each one of those, but we are going to share a few that will come up in the interview process. And we do that just to create awareness because we know that through awareness, that helps us to block the bias that we have. So let's cover a couple types of bias that might happen in the interview process. The first one is first impression bias. And that's the idea that, you're going to have a first impression of someone when they jump on the Zoom or when you meet them in person. And so you want to make sure, yes, of course, you're going to make some sort of first impression judgment, but don't count someone out because of the way that they look or how they're dressed. We want to make sure that, that's just one piece in the larger puzzle of what you're digging in on when you're interviewing the candidate. The second one is central tendency. And this is basically you're scoring everyone in the middle. And it's basically just, it's too hard to decide, or you don't want to be the person that is being too tough on the candidates. So you're not actually making a decision. You're scoring everyone in the middle. And unfortunately, that doesn't help us to get to the right candidate for the role. So just being thoughtful about how you're scoring folks. The third one is contrast. And this is the first candidate looked so bad that the second one is going to be amazing no matter what they say or do. So, that first candidate might, not answer correctly, might not do the right things as you're talking to them, that type of thing. And so no matter who comes through the door, that second person is going to look amazing. And this can happen in contrast too, where you have the first person that comes in the door is so amazing that no matter who else walks through the door, they can't measure up in any way, shape, or form. But looking at your competencies and kind of sticking to that competencies and asking for examples, that will help you to mitigate that contrast bias. Similarity bias is, hey, they look like me, or they had the same experience that I do, so they must be awesome because I'm awesome, right? And so being aware of that similarity bias, where just because they have the same experience that you do, or just because they've had the same career path, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be as awesome as you are. Inconsistency is where you are using different questions depending on the candidate. And we want to make sure that we are being extremely consistent with the candidates, everyone that walks through the door. So preparing questions ahead of time and making sure you're using the same ones really helps to make sure that you're not falling into that inconsistency bias. One caveat here is you're going to have your questions that you're going to prepare ahead of time to dig in on each competency. There might be probing that you need to do to dig in more. Obviously, those questions are going to be different just because it's going to depend on what they say first, what probing questions you ask. But you should have a list of questions that you are prepared before the meeting with the candidate. The halo and horn effect is basically when you are looking at one competency and one competency alone, and either measuring that in their favor so they get a halo, or measuring that not in their favor so they get horns. So the halo and horn effect can definitely impact if you're measuring one competency over another. Being thoughtful that you want to have some idea of what are those key things that they need, and consistently focusing on those. Stereotyping, hopefully we are pretty familiar with stereotyping and how that bias can kind of come into play in the interview process. But basically, it's making generalized opinions or preconceived notions about gender, religion, race, sexual orientation, or identity. An example of this, and this is just a joke, engineers. All engineers play Worlds of Warcraft in their basement and like Star Wars. So obviously that's a stereotype that is not accurate in any way, shape, or form. And we know that it's not accurate, but sometimes we use stereotypes and we unfortunately, make decisions because of that. So being aware of the stereotype bias. Gut feel is that it has nothing to do with competencies. It's just you like a person more than another. And so you think they might be a better fit than somebody else. And that gut fit can kind of lead you in the wrong direction because it can tie to some of these other bias that I already mentioned. And it shouldn't just be, hey, I feel like this is the right person. What are the skills? What are the competencies that they're bringing to the table to actually say, yes, this is the right person for us and for this job? So how do we reduce that bias? You create the awareness of what those biases might be, but then it's also looking at, okay, did we define the job requirements and competencies in the job posting? What are we looking for? What do you actually need in this role and for the candidate to have to make sure that they can do the job and actually knock it out of the park? Using consistent questions in the interview. So again, this is one where if you assign different competencies to different interviewers, meaning, hey, I would like you to focus on this competencies, you to focus on a different competency, that is, you're making sure you're asking consistent questions of each interviewee as well, because you want to have something to compare to. You want to be able to say, hey, we asked these questions. These are the examples that we got from candidate A versus candidate B. Candidate A's responses were better. The next one is don't make a snap judgment on candidates during the interview. They maybe will say something or will do something that raises a red flag. Don't necessarily discount them. It might be something that you just make a note of and then come back to, or, use that in your overall judgment, but don't discount someone if they misspeak or if they say something maybe doesn't quite fit. Dig in, probe, those types of things to make sure you understand what they're trying to say, because it might just be that they're using the wrong words. Be respectful of all candidates. They may be a potential partner or customer one day. This is one that I always like to remind folks when you are doing interviews. I've seen it many, many times, and we all realize that, it is a smaller industry world, situation, whatever we want to call it. And you will run across folks later in your career, and they could be a potential partner, they could be a customer, whatever it might be. So showing respect and making sure that you're really being thoughtful about their time, the fact that they've shown up, that they've prepared for an interview, just taking the time to really be respectful of that and thank them for that time. Use a competency scorecard. So this is one that, when you know what competencies you're looking for, if you have an actual scorecard that you're using, that helps you to decide, the answers that you need. How do they do on their answer? Was it, a 1, 2, or 3, or whatever scoring methodology you use? But having that scorecard will help you to determine who had the highest score, who was the best candidate, who was the best fit in regards to the competencies that they have. Focusing on values, not culture fit. So this is one that has come up, and we do realize that culture fit can be considered a bias. And the reason why is usually it's used as a, hey, they'll fit in here, or hey, they'll fit with the team. And what that translates to a lot of times is, hey, they're like us, and so they're going to fit in. What you want to do instead is really focus on values fit. Are they someone that is going to live the values of the organization? Are they someone who can do the job, so they have the competencies and the skills that you need, but also will live those values and do what's right for the team and for the overall organization? And the last one is asking for specific examples. So this one hopefully is very much what you've already learned, but when you're asking questions, don't let the candidate get away with giving you a vague answer. Ask for specific examples, ask for specific times when they did whatever it was that you're asking them to do from a competency perspective, and make sure you truly understand what was the whole situation. So asking for specific examples will help you. And this is also great if you have an interview team, so you have multiple people interviewing candidates, because when you come back, if they only have that one experience or example that they've shared with every single interviewer, then that will also be something that will tell you a little bit about that candidate. Do they actually have all of the experience you need? Or is this someone that maybe isn't the right candidate for you? So asking for those specific examples does help. And then lastly, I wanted to share this quote by Maya Angelou, because I think it's one that we all should be aware of as we think about interviewing candidates. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And we know this is extremely true, and this is definitely true for candidates as they approach their, trying to find a job in their job search. But it's also just important once they get on the team. So that's the last piece of advice we'll give you on the bias in the interview process. Thank you for listening.